Walk into the Seattle Underground tour today, and a guide will take you beneath the current street level and show you the original storefronts, the original sidewalks, the original doorways of a city that was simply built over. The windows that once looked out onto a busy commercial street now look out onto a ceiling. The doorways that once opened onto the sidewalk now open into a subterranean corridor. The street above your head was, in the 1880s, the ground. And the official story of why all of this exists is that the city burned down in 1889 and was rebuilt at a higher elevation to solve a sewage problem. That explanation is true. And it is also, in the way that all partial explanations are, a way of answering a specific question while making a larger one disappear. Because Seattle is not alone. Chicago did this, Denver did this, Sacramento did this. Parts of Atlanta, parts of Portland, parts of cities across North America sit on top of a previous layer that was not destroyed but buried, not demolished but built over. The pattern is too consistent across too many places to be explained entirely by fire and sewage engineering. And when you look at what was in those first floors, what was happening at street level in those cities in the decades before they were buried, and who made the decisions to raise the streets, a different story starts to take shape. The most documented case is Chicago, and Chicago is where this story has to start. Chicago in the 1850s was a city that had been built on swampy, low-lying ground at the edge of Lake Michigan. The drainage problem was severe. Streets flooded regularly. Sewage had nowhere to go. Typhoid and cholera moved through the population with the kind of efficiency that kills cities if it is not addressed. The engineer brought in to solve the problem was a man named Ellis Sylvester Chesbrough, and his solution was audacious. He proposed raising the entire city, not relocating it, not rebuilding it at a higher grade over time, raising the existing structures actively with jacks while simultaneously building up the street level around and beneath them. What followed between roughly 1855 and 1870 is one of the genuine engineering marvels of the 19th century American city. Buildings were lifted with hydraulic jacks, sometimes while businesses continued operating inside them. A workforce of hundreds would position jacks beneath a structure, turn them in coordinated increments, and inch the building upward. Streets were filled. The grade of the entire city rose by several feet in some areas, more than a dozen feet in others. The Chicago River was reversed. The new sewer system that went in as the streets rose was the most sophisticated in the country at the time. The official story ends there. Problem identified, engineering solution applied, city saved. And if you stop the story there, Chicago looks like a triumph of civic ambition, a young American city confronting an existential infrastructure problem and solving it through engineering ingenuity and collective will. That is a good story. It is taught in schools. It appears in architecture, textbooks, and urban planning histories as a foundational example of what American cities can accomplish when they decide to. But the official story glosses over a question that the engineering facts make unavoidable. Raising an entire city is not cheap. It is not a municipal infrastructure project funded out of normal tax revenues. It requires a concentration of capital that, in 1850s, Chicago only existed in a very small number of hands. And the people who provided that capital, who financed the raising of Chicago, did not do so out of civic virtue. They did it because the raising of Chicago was inseparable from the largest real estate restructuring in American urban history up to that point. When the streets go up and the existing ground floor becomes a basement, something happens to property values that is not complicated to understand. The buildings that can afford to be raised remain viable commercial properties. The buildings that cannot afford to be raised, the ones owned by smaller operators, by immigrant business owners, by the marginal enterprises that had occupied the original street level since the city's earliest days, those buildings do not get raised. They get absorbed. Their owners faced with the choice between a renovation cost they cannot finance and selling out to someone who can sell. The street raising project in Chicago was, among other things, a mechanism for transferring property from smallholders to large ones, at a moment when the land under Chicago was becoming extraordinarily valuable. The railroads were arriving, the grain trade was centralizing, the meatpacking industry was consolidating. Chicago was in the process of becoming the economic hub of the American interior, and the value of its commercial real estate was going to increase by orders of magnitude over the next 30 years. The people who understood this, who had the capital to act on that understanding, and the political connections to shape the infrastructure decisions that would determine which properties ended up on the new street level and which ended up buried, made fortunes. The people who did not understand it, or who understood it, but lacked the resources to respond, lost their businesses, and in many cases, their properties. The Great Fire of 1871 completed what the street raising had begun. The narrative of the fire as pure catastrophe, a random disaster from which Chicago heroically recovered, obscures the degree to which the recovery itself was shaped by the same interests that had shaped the street raising. The fire cleared the remaining ambiguity. Properties that had survived the elevation process but remained in the hands of smaller owners were now rubble, and rubble is purchased at different prices than functioning businesses. The Chicago that emerged from the 1870s and 1880s was more consolidated, more controlled, and more profitable for its major landholders than the Chicago that had existed before the streets went up. The pattern that Chicago established, the use of a genuine public infrastructure project to accomplish a simultaneous and largely unremarked restructuring of urban property ownership, did not stay in Chicago. It travelled with the capital and the engineers and the political models that Chicago exported to the rest of the developing American interior. Cities that faced similar problems, flooding, fire, sanitation, looked to Chicago as the example of how a modern city solved such things. They adopted the engineering methods, and with the engineering methods came the financial and political structures that had shaped how those methods were applied. Sacramento tells a similar story at a smaller scale. The city flooded repeatedly during the 1850s and 1860s, the Sacramento River running high after wet winters and inundating the commercial district with a regularity that was destroying property and driving out the less capitalized merchants. The solution, implemented in stages beginning in 1863, was to raise the street level by importing enormous quantities of fill, lifting it above the flood line. The original first floors of the downtown commercial district were buried. Some of them are still accessible today through what Sacramento markets as its own underground tour, the same genre of attraction as Seattle's, the same preserved storefronts and subterranean corridors. What the tours do not linger on is the question of who owned the buildings on the new street level and how they came to own them. The fill project in Sacramento was not a neutral public works initiative. It was financed and directed in ways that advantaged established capital and disadvantaged the smaller operators who had built the original city. The merchants who had arrived in the gold rush years, who had set up businesses at the original ground level on the basis of what they could afford in the early 1850s, found themselves facing the same choice that their counterparts in Chicago faced: pay to reconstruct at the new level or sell. The Central Pacific Railroad, which was consolidating its position in Sacramento during exactly this period, was among the interests that benefited most from the resulting property transfers. The Central Pacific's role in the Sacramento street raising has been documented by historians who look at the land transfer records, but it is not part of the standard civic narrative. The standard civic narrative is about flooding and engineering. The flooding was real. The engineering was real. The financial beneficiaries of both are a different conversation, and that conversation tends not to make it into the tour. Seattle's underground is the most famous and the most visited because the 1889 fire gave the street raising narrative a clean, dramatic turning point. Before the fire, original grade. After the fire, rebuilt at a higher level. The sewage problem was genuine. The tidal fluctuation in Elliott Bay created a situation where the original street grade was, at certain times, below the level of high tide, which meant that the sewage system ran backward. Rebuilding at a higher elevation solved this in a way that rebuilding at the original grade could not have. So the decision to raise the streets was not simply a land grab dressed up as public health. It was a real public health intervention. But it was also a land grab dressed up as public health. The businesses that had operated at the original street level in Seattle's commercial district were disproportionately Chinese-owned, immigrant-owned, and small. The Chinatown that had existed at the original grade was already under pressure before the fire. Anti-Chinese violence had been building in the Pacific Northwest through the mid-1880s, and the Seattle anti-Chinese riots of 1886 had already driven a significant portion of the Chinese population out of the city. The businesses that had survived those events were concentrated in the lower-lying commercial areas close to the waterfront at the original street level. When the city rebuilt above them, those businesses did not rebuild with it. The new street level was a white commercial district. The buried level had been, among other things, the economic infrastructure of a community that had been targeted for removal. The new commercial district that rose above the buried level in Seattle was built by men who already had capital and who understood that the post-fire rebuilding period was a window. Property that had burned was cheap. The regulatory environment around reconstruction was fluid. The decisions about which lots would face the new street and which would remain below grade were made in the first months after the fire, before most smaller owners had recovered enough to advocate for themselves effectively. By the time the physical reconstruction was complete, the ownership map of Seattle's downtown looked substantially different from the one that had existed the morning the fire started. This is not a coincidence. It is a pattern that repeats with local variations across the cases where American cities were physically restructured in the second half of the 19th century. The engineering problem was always real. The solution always served both the stated engineering purpose and a parallel purpose that involved the concentration of property and the displacement of marginalized commercial communities. The two functions were not separable. The people who financed and directed these projects understood both of them. The official histories preserved one and buried the other, along with the first floors. What is underground in these cities is not simply architecture. It is a record of an earlier economic order, one that was more distributed, more diverse, and more accessible to people without significant capital than the order that replaced it. The small merchants, the immigrant entrepreneurs, the informal economies that operated at street level before the streets went up, those enterprises were not casualties of progress in any simple sense. They were the target of a process that used public infrastructure to accomplish what would have been impossible, or at least more difficult, to accomplish through direct market competition alone. The tool was always something legitimate: flood control, fire recovery, sewage engineering. No one had to announce that the goal was to transfer property. The goal was achieved by shaping the conditions under which property either became more valuable or became worthless, and making sure that the people with capital were positioned on the right side of that line before the line was drawn. The streets went up. The first floors went under. The tour guides will show you the subterranean storefronts and tell you about the fire and the sewage problem, and the remarkable engineering achievement of lifting an entire city. All of that is true. But the floors did not bury themselves, and the people who decided exactly how high to raise the grade and which properties would be at the new street level and which would not, and who would finance the transition and on what terms, those people knew what they were doing. They always do. Walk back up into the sunlight at the end of the Seattle Underground tour and you are standing on top of the decision. You have been, your entire life, everywhere you have ever walked in any of these cities. The ground beneath your feet is not natural. It was put there by someone at a specific moment in history for reasons that the official story has been explaining only partially for 150 years. The buried floor is still there. It is not going anywhere. And the fact that it is underground is not an accident of geology or the neutral outcome of engineering necessity. It is a choice that someone made, and the choice tells you something about who built these cities and for whom that the surface never quite manages to say out loud.